find it hard to believe that you can really have any fundamental infrastructure like interoperability has to be if we want to live in this interoperable multi-chain world. That is kind of like, yeah, not fully open source. It's something that like, yeah, you have to ask for like permission to like have them deploy on your chain or anything like that.
Okay, awesome. We are live. Hi, everyone. Today we're here with Nam from Hyperlane. He's the CTO and co-founder. And we're going to be talking all about interop. So full disclosure, I do also work at Hyperlane, so I am slightly biased, but I hope like we can have like a nice discussion and kind of ask spicy questions to Nam. And okay, so first of all, I want to kick it off with a quick start from the basics. Like for listeners, just like getting into interoperability, can you talk about how the cross-chain interop landscapes looks like in Ethereum and how Hyperlane fits in?
Yeah, happy to. So I guess right, again that stop me if I go too like far back, right? But like what is the cool thing about like blockchains and Ethereum specifically is for developers to build these like applications, right, which are permissionless. Anybody can deploy them. Anybody can interact with those smart contracts, and so that's super cool. And one thing that kind of like right, like they eventually realized is like, oh, like block space is limited, and so like the gas, which is basically the metric by which we decide how much computation somebody can use, got expensive. And so Ethereum has spent a lot of time, right? Like we've been talking about this for years now in terms of like how to scale. And like part of it was just let's create another blockchain, right? Like we call those rollups. They have some other security guarantees that kind of like tie themselves to Ethereum. But the kind of like one of the like things that we lost kind of in that way was basically like composability between like blockchains, right? Like you deploy an app to like one blockchain, let's say like Optimism, but then if you wanted to interact with another app, of like state or something, right? That you want to deposit into like Avion base or something. Like now you no longer have that ability, right? That you no longer could call contracts. You can no longer make a view call against another contract. And so this problem of basically how do I interact with like state and contracts on another blockchain, that's kind of the general interoperability problem. And so yeah, let me know if that answered your question, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's great. And can you talk a bit about like how Hyperlane fits in as well? So once like the cross-chain problem is kind of, yeah, like that we have all these different blockchains who are basically their own islands, including like layer ones, layer twos, which can't talk to each other right now. So how does like Hyperlane kind of come in and, enable this?
Yes, so I think people very early on recognized that, like, right, like this is a real problem. Like, right, like how do you solve interoperability for developers and indirectly for users? And yeah, I think that like Hyphen is for sure not the first ones. Like we started about 3 years ago, but like there have been many attempts before that. And I'm happy to go into kind of like the technical, like I guess like details of those approaches. But I would roughly call these like 3 generations, right? The first generation was kind of like if you launched a new blockchain, right? Like either a new blockchain or a new rollup, right? Like it was basically your responsibility to figure out how to build a bridge, right? Like how to build a bridge, how to deploy a bridge, how to operate a bridge. And so we saw a lot of like I would say like first party attempts at this. I think like Avalanche's like bridge is an example of that. Like Near has the Rainbow Bridge, right? I think there's a lot of people who kind of tried to do that. And at some point, basically, there was a second generation of bridges, what I would call, which is basically like they realized, oh shit, like we should just have a dedicated team project work on interoperability, right? And so I think that's kind of like multi-chain, like Wormhole, Axelar, right? Like those kind of projects popped up for kind of the same reason of there's like, hey, like chains shouldn't do this themselves. But like one of the hardest things about interoperability is basically like how do you secure, right? Like the message. How does a contract on one chain know that like actually this message came from this other like from this other smart contract on a different chain? That's kind of like roughly like the verification problem basically. And so I think contracts, projects, interoperability projects of the second generation basically focused a lot on that aspect, I guess. But then like the kind of flip side of that problem was basically like that verification mechanism was often monolithic, right? So basically like it was like the wormhole validators, the Axelar validators, which meant that like if you launch a new blockchain, like you had to basically like convince them to like support your chain so that they provide that verification mechanism for your chain. And so I would call Hyperlane as kind of an example, I would say, of the third generation of interoperability protocols, who basically recognize that, like, yes, the verification problem is a very important problem, but there's no such thing as like a singular verification mechanism that can actually support every chain, right? And so Hyperlane and others are basically examples of Modular, interoperability protocols, which basically allow different verification mechanisms to be used as a choice for application developers. And then also it allows other people who basically built better verification mechanisms to kind of like plug themselves in as a module instead of having to like build another interoperability protocol from scratch.
That like basically answers my first question, because I'm thinking, okay, so you guys started thinking about bridging like all the way back in the IBC, like 2018, 2019, 2017 days.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly ZK has made huge progress between now and then. If you picked a winner back then, it's certainly not the winner now. And so I'm thinking that like this elephant in the room might be, well, ZK tech has improved so much that whatever you picked back then wasn't the right one at this point. But
Mm-hmm.
you just said modularity is key. And the key is like having these like plug and play modules that allow you to plug in ZK as ZK tech becomes more advanced, and still have the optionality to plug in other verification methods. So I'm kind of answering my own question, but I think that's true. But maybe you could double click on that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, right, like a lot of, I would say, technologies that we've been able to observe in our space over the years, right, are like super exciting, right? Like I think ZK is one of them, right? Like rollups another. And I think it totally makes sense to me that like, right, like our future is going to look like that, right? But similar with rollups, right? It's taking a long time to get to like, right, like even stage 0, stage 1, stage 2 rollups. And I think the question that like developers that build applications today have to ask themselves is like, hey, like, yes, I understand that like that is the future, but like what do I do today, right? And so I think modularity, in our opinion, is the answer to basically allow application developers to build the applications today and have, right, like, yeah, maybe like slightly different, maybe worse trust assumptions than like, let's say, like a ZK verification mechanism. But like when those verification mechanisms kind of become available, become practical, become like cheap enough, fast enough, all these kind of things, then they are able to basically like upgrade into those seamlessly without having to like re-architect the application. And I think that's kind of like obviously our biased view of like why we kind of get the best of both worlds.
And if we zoom in on the tech, you said you were willing to dive in here. I think it's worth looking at a little bit. Like even when we look at any of these different generations, there's, like Etta said, an island, right? And this island is like crypto economically secure. There's like a lot that goes into making this blockchain like nation state level hard. And there's a lot that goes into making this other blockchain over here nation state level hard. But the gooiness in between is what we're talking about, and it's tricky. But I think that it comes down to, and my question is like, what does it come down to? It must be like these events on one blockchain, and then we've seen like multi-sigs in the past kind of controlling that, and then like over on the other side, you're waiting for those events to be definitely secure, and then you maybe release assets or send a message on the other side. Can you talk about like what makes that GUI stuff in the middle as hard as the two different blockchains on the side of it?
Yes, like if like if you think about it, like the rollup problem, right? Like how do you create a blockchain basically that is able to like leverage the crypto economic security of like the layer one underneath it, right? It's actually the same problem as the bridge problem, right? Like basically how do you prove on L1 that something happened on L2, right? Like really like when we think about like optimism and arbitrum, basically having spent years, right, like of time basically working towards like what it is today, it is them spending years on what I call this like verification mechanism of like proving that like some state actually happened from a remote chain. And I guess the interoperability is really the generalized version of it, which is basically like not just from like optimism on Ethereum, right, but from optimism on any other chain. And again, I'll be very honest, right? Like that's a very hard problem. And I think, like you mentioned, like the simplest solution, right, is to basically make it a multi-sig, right? Like I think that's the like starting place from which most, I think, interoperability starts. And again, the hope is that like as we are able to, right, let's say like OP succinct, right, like as we're able to basically prove out the roll-up straight transition function inside a ZK proof, then like other chains can use this, right? Like there's other constructs that you can use, right? Like you could actually like when you want to send a message from optimism to base, let's say, right? Like Superchain, like the Optimism Collective is working on like the Superchain, right? They basically like allow the state transition function of one rollup to depend on the state transition function of another rollup, and you basically then avoid the need for multisig, and you just have these like native trust assumptions, and you move the complexity into the like rollup bridge back to down to L1. So that's one option, right? Like another option is to like have basically crypto economic guarantees by using the like rollup bridge to communicate the slashing condition to L1. And so basically you still have a multisig, but like the signers on the multisig can basically have economic stake attached to their like attestations, and then they get slashed if that happens, right? And so there's a lot of like very interesting mechanisms that can be used to basically, right, like go from just a simple multisig to a more advanced multisig to like, eventually again these like very heavy constructions. But I think the point here is that like as an application developer, right, like I want to be able to build today, and like I want to be able to like configure basically the kind of trust assumptions of this gooiness depending on my application, right? Because like if I build an app today, like like a game or something, like I might not care that much about it. But if I eventually, right, like build like fundamental financial rails for like a very large system, like then I for sure care about that. And so I think it's just like hard to kind of like, I think sometimes the discourse basically says like, oh, if it's not like X, then like it's insecure. And I think in reality, security is definitely like a trade-off as part of the like simplicity, cost, speed spectrum.
I think this is a great segue into the like thinking in the lens of a developer. So like let's say like I'm a developer, I'm building like a prediction market on an exchange. Like let's say I'm building on Base. Like how does my process look like to kind of make it like a cross-chain app?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And to be honest, like I think when we started, we kind of thought that like people would build a lot more of this, what we call basically like native cross-chain applications, right? And I think the reality is basically that, right? Like I think most of our like content and tutorials and everything, right, are geared towards single chain applications, right? Like you like when you learn like Solidity, like you never get kind of exposed to that concept of like, oh, I now have to like fetch like state from a different blockchain. And so I think what we see is like it's a little bit difficult right now. And it's kind of like if we like translate this to Web 2, right? Like it's kind of the same problem of like if you build an application just on one machine versus like a distributed like system basically where like your code runs on multiple machines and they kind of coordinate with each other, right? And so I think we've seen a kind of same transition happen, right? Like in the Web 2 world, like probably in the early 2010s, where people moved away from like just like writing code for a single machine. And I think that's kind of like the same thing that we would have to do here. And I think honestly, we're still in the early days of figuring out like, okay, like what are like good patterns for people to do, right? Like one of the common patterns that we, for example, see right now is that like, well, if you want to have build this like natively cross-chain application, you probably need a smart contract on every chain, right? And then you need this ability to send messages between your contracts on every chain. And so you at minimum need to basically like know about the existence of those other smart contracts. So you probably want to have like an internal mapping on your contract that basically like tells you like, hey, right, I'm prediction market contract on Base, and this is like 0x123, and 0x789 is like the prediction market contract on like Optimism. And then I basically like that. Then I know, okay, who do I have to send a message to? But also like I know, okay, if I receive a message, I have to like verify that this message came from this other smart contract there, right? I think the second thing that you have to kind of do is like think about asynchrony, right? Like again, in the single chain context, you just make a call, and like in the context of that transaction, it just like instantly returns the result, right? Versus like in cross blockchains, like that, like we currently not yet have like synchronous composability. And so like you need to send a message and then you need to have like a callback upon which you basically receive the message back with the result of some kind of like computation or like query. And so those are kind of like two of the, I would say, very basic like kind of like considerations that you have to like think about when building a natively cross-chain application that currently, right, like most I guess blockchain developers don't have to think about.
This is a really interesting pattern because, like you said, every time I've thought about building something on chain, I'm thinking about a single chain, single set of contracts, but it's all atomic. It all like handles itself. And what you're saying is like that's not the future. And I think I agree. The future is actually going to be a lot more complicated because we're going to have disparate liquidity. We're going to have different. So now let's think of a game. It's probably, you can imagine, and I think even Farcaster does this, where it's like some on a Base, some on Optimism, but not just like a prediction market where you can buy into the liquidity on any chain. It's almost like the map is on Optimism and the swords are on Base and the treasure chest is on ZK Sync, and you need to go between all of those to do a simple action where you hit a treasure chest with the sword and it measures if the strength is enough. So we still have like this kind of synchronous, asynchronous, like I'm going to send it and not know if it completes, but then I have to just like let it go and then check on it later. Like what?
Yeah.
How does this change? Like, okay, and even like when I first learned about a flash loan, it like blew my mind, right? I feel like there's something of that here where there's like an essence of something that's like a completely new paradigm that I haven't really tapped into here. But like, what does this game look like? Give me some more insights into like this cross-chain. I don't even know the assumptions, the mechanism, there's something here.
Yeah, like again, I think to be honest, I don't know that I know what that is, right? Like in some ways, right? Like I'm kind of the like I'm giving the kind of this like new computation ability, right? Of like being able to send messages across. But like it's really like developers who decide like, okay, cool, what kind of games can I build with that? Because I'm definitely not a game developer, right? Like I don't even know like right like what kind of considerations you have to do, right? Like and so I think that's kind of like I think what makes honestly the space generally tricky because right? Like application developers are the ones that have the need to create these experiences, but they don't want to build all the infrastructure to like obviously like secure these messages between different blockchains and like all this that goes in there. And similarly for me, right? Like I'm working on this infrastructure, but like I don't know, right? Like how like what kind of like things I need to do to build like a game like you just described. And so um I think like definitely again asynchrony and like the fact that like honestly like things can fail is like yeah an important consideration that like I think developers need to make. But in terms of like yeah right like what are other patterns that kind of like make these games kind of like more accessible and more successful as a cross-chain game, let's say, that's definitely something that I would love to obviously like chat more with people about because I think that's something that like like the reality of interop today is that a lot of interop is basically token based, right? Like most interop people kind of synonymously basically think of interoperability as like token bridging. And I think it makes sense because there's like a lot of value and a lot of activity in on that front. But certainly, we're starting to see like I think interesting things about about games, right? About like kind of chain abstraction, where like right like users don't have to think about that, and that's obviously like kind of the end game, right? Like we have things like, right, like, oh, if you want to vote in a DAO, right? Like you should be able to have a token on any chain and then vote in that DAO from any chain, right? Like if you use like a safe, right? Like you should be able to use that safe on every chain. You shouldn't have to like replicate the safe configuration on every chain, on every chain. And so there's a lot of these kind of primitives that I think, yeah, we're seeing right now, and I'm happy to go into those. But like ultimately what people do, right? Like how do people combine and kind of like deploy those things. I think that's obviously the magic of like having permissionless application infrastructure.
So I still want to dig in and understand the security assumptions of this like asynchronous game where we've got the treasure chest on one chain and the sword on another chain, and the sword hits the treasure chest. And you need to know, and let's say that there's plenty of power and it looks like it's going to open, but then there's like a reorg on the other chain. The security assumptions have to basically understand like the depth of where it was in terms of the reorg ability, and there can't be a reorg on either chain, and you have to understand that some chains are going to have a reorg or not. And so the hardness of those messages, there must be like a delay in between where on the chain where I've hit the chest and it looks like it's going to be enough, I have to then say, yes, that event has happened, but we have to wait 5 blocks on that other chain before I can release this, whatever's inside the chest, to make sure there's not a reorg with the sword. Is that, I'm a game developer just trying to figure it out, but is that close to maybe how they'll be thinking about it?
Yes, I think there's two things that you said that's interesting to check in on. So, right, like, yeah, basically to account for the asynchrony, let's say, right, like you have a sword and you hit a chest, but the chest is on another chain, right? Like you have to basically send a message over to the chain that has the chest and basically say like, hey, this sword is hitting this chest, right? But like you on the origin chain, like you don't know if that like chest hit actually went through because actually maybe from another chain, right? Like somebody's trying to hit exactly the same chest and there's no atomicity, right? And so basically only on the chain that has the chest, you basically like, I guess whichever message arrives first, right, gets to hit the chest. And then when the second message arrives and it realizes, oh shit, this chest has already been hit, it needs to send a message back to, right, like the chain that has the sword and basically say like, I know you tried to hit the chest, but somebody like preempted you. And so you need to like possibly roll some state back, or like you need to like, right, like return back like, I don't know, some money to the sword holder or something. And so that's, again, right, like you mentioned, fundamentally different than like in a single chain context, because obviously in a single chain context, you can rely on the blockchain serially, basically like kind of like letting you hit that chest. I think the second thing you mentioned was reorgs. And I think, right, like again, in a single chain context, you don't have to think about reorgs, because like if the chain reorgs, the transaction never happened, basically, right? Versus like if you have basically a state transition that spans multiple blockchains, like if the second part reorgs, then the first, what do you do with the first part, right? Like in a normal like single chain context, that first part also would never happen. And so that's fundamentally something that, again, you as a developer have to like think about, basically, that like the second thing may never happen, right? Or like may happen under different state assumptions than like you originally did. And so the same thing with like a message, right? Like let's say like a message like attests to some state from an origin chain that happened, but then that chain reorgs. Like honestly, now you're in just like very bad territory. And I think for a developer, I think you honestly kind of have to like trust basically that the bridge like verification mechanism that you use accounts for the reorg, because if you do have a reorg, then that just becomes very difficult to reason about for, I think, a developer. And that's why it's so important that obviously the interoperability protocol that you use kind of account for that.
Yeah, interoperability has so many like deep dives that you can go through, like especially when you talk about a game scenario. I think it gets even more complicated. So I want to like go back and see like how Hyperlane is used today. So can you give like some examples? Perhaps it's not going to be like a game where you have like different assets on many different chains, but I guess like, to start simple to make sure like we have like a good mental model. Can you talk a bit about the use cases today?
Yeah. Yeah. So like I mentioned, I think the primary use case of interoperability today is basically like token bridging, right? Let's say if you have a token which has some logic that, right, like basically tells you like how to mint the token, how to burn the token, how people can transfer the token, right? Like basic ERC20, right? Like typically it happens on a single chain, right? Let's say like you launch a meme coin on Base, right? And you have a token now, but like people basically hold, let's say, assets on Arbitrum. They're like, oh, I want to buy this meme token, right? The question is either like you want to facilitate the bridging of that user over to Base so that they can then go buy that meme token, or the reverse, right? Like you want to have a representation of that meme token on Arbitrum so that people can, right, like use a DEX to like acquire basically like that meme token. And so like the way this typically happens, or like very often happens, is via like what's called a lock and mint token bridge. So you have a smart contract on Base, which basically like people are allowed to deposit that meme token, let's say, into that smart contract, which then sends a message of like, hey, deposit like 10 tokens over to Arbitrum, and then the recipient smart contract on Arbitrum basically like verifies that message came from that deposit contract, and then mints basically a synthetic version, right, like 10 of those to the recipient of that transfer, right? And so basically like as a holder of that synthetic token on Arbitrum, like you can look at these contracts and be like, hey, like this is the only circumstance under which the synthetic token gets minted. And so that will always be a claim on the underlying collateral on the deposit contract. And so if you ever want to go back, you take the synthetic contract, you give it back to the contract on Arbitrum, you you burn that token on Arbitrum, that sends a message over to Base, and then that releases the token back to the recipient. And so that is, right, like a fundamental thing about that's the primary objective, I would say, of like a lot of interoperability today, is to basically facilitate this token bridge, right? Like rollup bridges are exactly the same, right? Like when you bridge over from Ethereum to, let's say, Base, right? Like what you're really doing is you're depositing ETH in the rollup bridge contract on Ethereum on L1. That sends a message, right, like to the rollup, which then mints you kind of like a claim, really, on the ETH on Base, and then you can transact with it on Base and then go back again.
I see. And I do want to I usually don't like to talk about like specific, or like give names of protocols or like instances, but I think it's cool to mention like the contracts there are like the mailbox, like in the Hyperlane contracts. So basically the deposit contracts are like called mailbox contracts, which kind of is like your segue into different chains, and then you have agents in between which carry the messages. I think that was like, that made it very clear for me to understand.
Yeah.
Just like thinking about like, so you have like those different chains, you have smart contracts on them called mailbox smart contracts, and then you have agents in between, which both like facilitate the message carrying, but also make sure that all the messages are secure with your different modules, which you can add to be like, okay, I'm going to use ZK for security, or I'm going to use like a multisig for security, like the different modular security approaches there. And with that, I also kind of want to transition to interoperability within different domains. Like, for example, the Superchain, they have like their own interoperability, which they're building. But recently there was like a new Superlane that come up. And when we were actually discussing this, I think there's too many super words in there. But basically the idea there is that Superchain will have their own native interoperability. But you can actually kind of have that interoperability with Hyperlane via something called the Superlane now. So can you deep dive into what that means and how that was built and what's the process over there?
Yeah. Yes, good point, Anna. Yeah, so I think maybe to repeat, I think what you said, right? Like the kind of the base entry points for developers to basically like use interoperability with Hyperlane are these things we call the mailbox contracts, which are basically like you call a contract with a message, which then sends like, right, like there's going to be some mechanism by which it sends that message over to the mailbox contract on a destination chain, which will then call the like actual recipient of that message on the destination chain, right? And so, like I think we said in the beginning, like this is ultimately secured and facilitated by like modular pieces, right? So like in the default, on most routes, like there is kind of like a validator-based multisig, which basically attests to that message actually happening on the origin, so that like that message gets processed on the destination chain. But like many people and projects have kind of like realized that like, hey, like we think that like for our ecosystem, we can create a better trust assumptions than having to trust these like external validators, right? And so folks, like I would say Optimism is probably one of the ecosystems that are furthest along that basically recognizes like, hey, like we can build basically like interoperability into the rollup stack itself, right? And so basically that's, I think, what they call the superchain, which again is this like idea that like, hey, the rollup state transition function of the destination chain can actually account for the like actual state transition of the origin chain. And so they call it superchain. And I think the like nice thing about the Hyperlane architecture is that basically Superchain can just be a module inside Hyperlane that like developers can basically choose to use, right? And so basically as a developer, you still get to use exactly the same mailbox interface. Like you still build your contracts with exactly one interface, but then upgrade basically into the superchain trust assumptions where you no longer have to use validators when the superchain goes live, right? And so I think that's kind of like something that like we dub Superlane, right? Like the Velodrome folks have been doing that because they basically said like, hey, like we want to launch our kind of cross-chain experiences today, but we want to be able to do so in a way where like we get to use like the native interoperability trust assumptions of the superchain. So yeah, let me know that answer your question.
And that makes sense that the shared sequencer or whatever is happening between these like OP, you've got OP stack here and OP stack here, and the way that the superchain works is you can talk between those, but it's still not going to talk to all the other liquidity in the space where that's where you guys come in and where you guys are more competitive. You're not using the underlying assumptions of the protocol. You're using this modular system that lets multiple chains from all sorts of diverse backgrounds talk to each other, right? And that's kind of, I'm guessing what your strategy is like, even though you can build this into your protocol, you're still going to want access to all these other chains. So we're going to do it this other way. Is that right?
Yes, right. Like think of it like, I mean, there's a lot of mental models that people try to use in interop. And like one of the ones I, for example, use to like note for this kind of concept of modularity, right? As if like transport, like physical transport, like if you literally want to send a mail, right? Like if I want to send a mail, like I live in New York right now, in Brooklyn, and I want to send mail to like the Bronx, right? Like probably the best module to use is the subway, right? Like just take the subway and go to the Bronx, deliver the mail. But like right, like if I want to go from like New York to like LA, right? Like I'm not like I can't use the subway, right? Or like I have to use like right, like a plane, or I have to like go by foot, who knows, right? But like there's going to be 4 different routes. There's just going to be different like trade-offs available, and like you as a developer, like you want to have the flexibility of choosing one over the other, and not just like have like one mode of transport, so to speak, that can go everywhere.
I think that's a great analogy. And I want to go back a bit to the Superlane stuff because I think that not only like that also highlights the open source ecosystem, like both Hyperlane being permissionless and you can go do it, and kudos to the OP stack optimism folks as well for having it like all open. Can you talk about how that process kind of worked? I guess like I'm curious to see like like I'm a developer like building something right now, like how like is it open source? How can I use it today? And the Superlane example is actually a really good one to illustrate.
Yes, I think the thing that I've been building, I guess, Hyperlane for 3 years now, and I think one of the things that I always find interesting is that there's like obviously technically everything's open source in that like there's smart contracts on chain, and I guess sometimes they're not verified, in which case you could argue if they're open source or not. Um, but like a lot of experiences that builders have today with interoperability projects basically require you to like talk with the team, right? Like if you want something from the team, you have to go to their website, fill out a form, and hope that you're important enough that they will return your call, right? And as a developer myself, I'm just like I don't want to do that. Like I just like I don't love talking to people. I just like love building, and so I think one of the things that's very cool about I think like how I think Superlane has kind of come around is that like optimism embodies very much that same spirit, right? Like you can look at like all of their specs, you can look at the like call notes of like how they've talked about kind of the super chain, what trade-offs they involve, and like what the interfaces are for that. And that makes it super easy, right? Like for somebody like me who like is building on Zimmer protocol to basically like build this module that uses the super chain to do this, right? And like when I did that, right, like I didn't have to like sign an NDA or I have to do anything. But also like when I do this, it's like just on our public monorepo, right? Like anybody can now like use this module and like use it with SuperSim, which is their kind of like local simulation of the superchain until it's like live on mainnet, and then basically use it with that, right? And so I think that to me is just like I find it hard to believe that you can really have any fundamental infrastructure like interoperability has to be if we want to live in this multi-chain world that is kind of like not fully open source. That's something that like you have to ask for like permission to like have them deploy on your chain or anything like that. And so like the thing that I love about Hyperlane is definitely it's fully open source. We have like guides that show you right like exactly like how you deploy Hyperlane, how you use Hyperlane, how you change the security modules. And I think that's kind of like the only way to really like be able to build a project that I can actually have these kind of like different modules for like not just the super chain, right, with like ZK things like Elastic Chain and like all these other kind of like Ag layer, all these other kind of like roll up like cluster support.
I think you touched on an important point just to double click on it again. Is basically there was also this tweet which went viral about the cost of like launching a new rollup, like what it takes. You need like a kind of Etherscan equal like a block scanner. You need to connect to other chains. You probably want to have like some you want to have it on like major exchanges, etc. And the cost is like very astronomical. So it doesn't really make sense, especially when we live like in an open source world when and having like more roll up as the services come out, everyone kind of deploys their own chain. So you want to have like interoperability by default. Like it should be part of like when you deploy a new style, like a new chain roll up, you definitely want to have some kind of connectivity. Otherwise, you're like very isolated.
Yes.
And this ties into like the permissionless interoperability thesis with both Superlane and the other chains as well. I guess I'm kind of I kind of wanted to point this out too because I feel like it's very important. And another question I have is, can you talk a bit about like how people can get started with Hyperlane, especially like if you can mention the bounties, because they're like a really good way for any developer to go in and start building.
Yep. Yeah, I want to, before I answer that question, I want to, I think, also maybe reiterate what you said right before that, right? About, again, like this like notion of permissionlessness, right? Because again, like, why is blockchain interesting at all, right? Like, blockchains are interesting because, like, you don't have to ask permission to build an application, right? Like, that I think is just like something that you believe should exist, either because you just like doing it, right? Which I think is a lot of us, or because you think, like, oh, this is like like a big need in the market and I want to build that application. And for a lot of things, like like in the Web2 world, especially like when they touch like money and finance, that becomes very difficult, right? Like if you are just like a say a solo developer in like, let's say the Philippines, right? And like you want to serve like customers in the US, like it becomes very, very difficult to do so. And I think blockchains are really interesting because they allow you to like do that without needing to ask anyone for permission. And I think the same way, like you said, has to apply for like chains, right? Like I think the typical like analogy I use is right, like when you want to launch a token, right? Like that's what happened obviously for a lot of industry. And like until we had like DEXs, right? Like you had to basically be big enough, you had to raise enough money to convince like a centralized exchange to list your token. And that just like fundamentally limited the potential of like developers to build cool things. And with the launch of Uniswap, right, like anybody could list a token, provide a little bit of liquidity in the pool, and then like have that kind of be part of the application experience. And that obviously like allowed way more developers to build cool stuff. And so the same way I'm hoping, right, that like if you like launched like the cloud, right, in like the 2000s, like the cloud allowed developers to no longer have to think about infrastructure and allow anybody to kind of build these cool applications like Uber or Airbnb and whatnot. Like definitely, I think the only way for cool applications to be built is for like infrastructure to be open source and permissionless. To that point, to your second question, the way people can get started, right, is to like go on a docs, like you can deploy Hyperlane to a new chain, right? Like it's that you just download our CLI, npm, like there's a docs, it's like 4 steps, like it's I think it's 4 or 5 commands, and then you have Hyperlane. We can like deploy a very basic token bridge contract, which basically allow you to like take again tokens as collateral and mint a synthetic version. We have an out-of-the-box template UI. Again, it's on our docs that allow you to just like add your configuration and then like deploy, push it on Vercel, and then bam, you have a bridge UI for your chain, right? And again, like people used to charge for this like a lot of money, like 6 figures. And like this is all open source, all accessible like today on our docs. And yeah, super excited to see what people will build with that.
And what a developer really should do, like here's how a developer hits a grand slam for Hyperlane. Basically, they go find a couple different chains with different assumptions, and they use them in Symfony to make a game work. So maybe we've got our chest on one chain and our sword on the other chain or something like that. But you also want to lean into, you were talking about blockchains being permissionlessly composable. And I think that needs to be a major part of the game where anybody can use the sword anywhere. But I think also blockchains have different hardness. We've kind of talked about the hardness and the gooiness in between. But you want to lean into the hardness of a different chain. So say your game has this currency that is very hard. Maybe it can be a stable coin that lives on Ethereum, and you only like convert into like the gold of the game if you wanted to leave it in a very like hard place. But maybe you wanted to go questing and you might want to grab like maybe like an ounce of gold and throw that in your pocket, aka like move it over to base or to ZK Sync or something like that. And then maybe you have the movement of the game in some other L2 or L3 that's good at handling maybe movement or even like collision detection. I can't imagine a game that has collision detection on chain, but let's imagine that. Yeah. And then maybe your assets live in another place, right? So if someone could build something that correctly uses, first of all, showing off this permissionless composability thing that blockchains give us, but also this like different levels of hardness for different types of assets or different types of mechanisms. If someone builds that, I feel like that would be a real grand slam for you guys in terms of like showing interop and showing the hardness of blockchains in Symfony.
Yeah, I think as you say that, like I think one of the things that I personally am very excited about, right, is that the fact that people can like launch basically new blockchains easier now with like rollups or service providers is that they can also customize the block space much more easier, right? Like basically today, if you build a game on Ethereum and like you want, let's say, like a random function, right? Like there's nothing available, right? Like, but like somebody could basically launch a rollup, right, that basically has built-in like random function in as a precompile, let's say, right? And you use basically something like Hyperlane to basically like query for that randomness, right? Or like there's like chains that have like basically like inference, right, with AI models, so that like you can actually run that logic on chain. And I think the notion is basically like, yeah, you allow people to kind of offer these different kind of primitives for then developers to pull, right, like the kind of relevant information from these different blockchains and like have a game that can actually like use all of it without needing basically have like one blockchain that has all the features. And so I think that's like definitely really cool. I think the second thing is actually one of the first, like actually literally the first like demo that we thought of building on top of Hyperlane that we never got around to was, if you're familiar with like Our Place, right, which is kind of collaborative, like kind of like pixel game, right, where like people can like draw over it. We're always like, hey, how cool would it be if there was an Our Place that just like basically has like different pixels can only be colored from like specific chains, or like there might be like like different color per chain, and then have this kind of like collaborative game that allow people to kind of like build this together. You right, like highlight kind of like that, hey, like these chains are together, can be composed together. Like I think that's like, again, another cool thing. In general, like I think as I mentioned, we have a bunch of like bounties on our GitHub repo where we have kind of some of these ideas that people can kind of like get inspired by, either as an application or even as a feature, right? Like for Hyperlane, like we mentioned, everything is open source. There's like like bounties that if you're looking basically for like an idea of like, hey, I want to contribute, I want to kind of get involved. Like I think bounties are a great way to kind of get started, get familiar, and so I definitely encourage people to check those out.
I'm already inspired. And you were talking about having like randomness versus LLMs versus different parts and different chains. So our LLM that like lives in an SGX over here, this is going to be our game master. So we're going to have our chest and our sword, but we still have to go to the game master to have it decide like what happened this round and what's the new, boss that we're fighting. And then when it goes to like roll the dice, then it goes to another chain to get its randomness. Oh man, I'm inspired. Let's go build it.
There
Let's
you go.
So what are you excited about most? Like I'm beaming with excitement here, but you kind of gave us a little glimpse of the composability stuff, but what else?
Yeah.
Like, what are you excited about just in general in the space?
So I would say, I guess, so let me start with interoperability first, and then maybe like the space more broadly, right? So I think, I guess with interoperability more specifically, I'm really excited about, I think people just recognizing the kind of like this like open source nature, right? Like I think, again, the experience of most people has been with bridges is that basically like one of a service provider, right? Like, hey, here's a service provider, like again, sign up, like hopefully I'm important enough to interact with them. And I think we're now just seeing kind of the really like nice benefits of, again, of an open source project where people, right, like take your project, they fork it, they like kind of modify it to their own needs, and they can do that. And like, but they will also be able to contribute back, right, like to the kind of like upstream of our project. And so I think just like super excited about a lot of like the people who are working kind of like not just like on top of Hyperlane, but like in Hyperlane to kind of like improve it. And that's, I think, honestly, like, I've worked on open source before, and I think it's always the best feeling if you're working on an open source project and like other people actually like, like think that this is a cool thing for them to do themselves. And like, sometimes they do things that you don't want, like, oh, I didn't want to do this, but like if they want to do it, that's fine. And so I think that's kind of like one of the most exciting things that we're seeing in the recent weeks and months. I think that's like, super cool. I think for the space more broadly, what am I excited about? I guess I'm definitely excited about like the fact that like things are cheap. Like I think like it was not like something like 2 years ago when everybody was like how will we ever get mass adoption? Like if we have to pay like $1 just to do like a simple transfer. And so I think the fact that like honestly, like as far as I can tell, most people don't think about gas anymore, right? Like especially on L2s, is like I think an amazing accomplishment that like sometimes we kind of like underappreciate. And that's just gonna go right like further because again, we'll be able to create more of these rollups, and we're building this infrastructure, right, to allow these people to create these like LLM rollups or like randomness rollups. And so I think that's like like I think super exciting. And I know like people always like say like, oh, like people build too much infra, but like I think I've in my past worked on projects that have tried to build apps, and then you always inevitably end up building infra because you're like, well, I need this to be able to build my application. And so certainly it's like a push and pull, and I don't think it's as black and white either, as in like infra is great, but definitely excited about kind of like what we've been able to accomplish so far, and hopefully how much more we can go.
We dived into a lot today, and I can also just add a bit, but I also wanted to mention, I feel like I've been in the space for 3 years, and there've been like cycles of different stuff which are exciting. Like it was, account abstraction, then it kind of came, and then we had like there was a time where restaking was very exciting, and I feel like now we're at the time where the hottest topic is interop for sure. So I think it's a great time to be working in like building cross-chain applications. So Nam, I kind of want to give the last words to you. We are almost at the end. So if you have any call to action for developers or anyone listening, we will be adding all the links. And I do think the docs are the best place to start. And also to mention, so we will be at DevCon as well. There's going to be, well, I think everyone is going to be at DevCon. So if you're listening and if you can come, I think that's amazing. But I want to give the last word to you and say thank you again for coming on. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, I think I don't often get maybe the audience of like, like I think people who are just very interested in like building things, are interested in like what's available. And I guess maybe the first thing I want to say is basically like keep building. Like, I think it's something that sometimes I like don't get enough of the time and chance to do so. But like, yeah, I think whatever happens, like, yeah, keep building, keep having high expectations of like the things that you use around you. Like, don't settle for, again, proprietary like kind of services, even if you feel like there's a lot of options. And so, all about like, the ethos of like, open and permissionless, I think kind of like carry that into the world. And if you have basically kind of like needs or desires basically to work with Interop, either on top of Interop or like work on the Interop itself, like I mentioned, everything is open source. Our docs kind of show you a bunch of guides for different use cases that you can use. We have a great CLI that people can use to deploy both Hyperlane itself as well as these token bridges. But definitely the bounties, I think, are like a great place to start. And if you're ever kind of wondering, like, come join our Discord, like, feel free to ask your questions there. And if not, feel free to tag like either the Hyperlane main chat or myself on like Twitter or other socials to kind of like, ask any questions or like get any support that you need.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.